Hello and welcome to the Saturday Review, your weekly look at the biggest stories shaping justice, society and human potential. Each week we go beyond the headlines to explore the evidence, ideas and the bigger questions behind the news, bringing together research, lived experience and balanced analysis to help make sense of an increasingly complex world. I'm Adam J. Robinson and this is the Saturday Review. This week, Britain woke to the shocking news that former Conservative MP and Reform UK politician Anne Widdecombe had been murdered. Counter-terrorism policing are now leading the investigation, but Parliament has rightly urged politicians, the media and the public not to speculate while the investigation remains ongoing. At the time of this upload, we simply do not know why this happened. What we do know is that another prominent political figure has lost their life, and that alone should concern every one of us. Regardless of your politics, whether you agreed with Anne Widdecombe or strongly opposed everything she stood for, violence has no place in a democratic society. This isn't simply a story about one individual. It's a story about the health of British democracy. Political violence is not new. Britain's only Prime Minister to be assassinated was Spencer Perceval in 1812. In 1979, Airy Neave was murdered by the Irish National Liberation Army. More recently, Labour MP Joe Cox was murdered in 2016 while meeting constituents. In 2021, Conservative MP Sir David Amess was murdered during a constituency surgery, doing precisely what MPs are elected to do, meeting the public. Now, once again, Britain finds itself asking difficult questions about the safety of those who enter public life. History reminds us that democracy has always required courage. Yet there appears to be a growing concern that entering politics today brings risks that previous generations could scarcely have imagined. Political scientists have long argued that violence against elected representatives does more than harm individuals. It strikes at democratic legitimacy itself. The aim is not simply to silence one voice. It sends a message to every other politician. It asks, could you be next? French philosopher Michel Foucault offered an interesting way of thinking about power. Unlike traditional theories, Foucault argued that power is not something possessed by governments alone. Instead, power exists in relationships. It flows throughout society in institutions, language, culture, and everyday interactions. From that perspective, political violence becomes more than physical harm. It becomes an attempt to reshape power through fear. When elected representatives begin changing how they engage with constituents because they fear attack, violence has already altered democratic relationships. That should concern every citizen. Democracy depends upon disagreement, yet democracy cannot survive if disagreement becomes intimidation. One of the most troubling developments in recent years has been the rise of hostility directed towards politicians online. Research analysing millions of posts sent to UK MPs found that abusive messages increased significantly between the 2015, 2017 and 2019 general elections, with prominent politicians receiving particularly high levels of sustained abuse. Researchers have warned that persistent online hostility risks normalising contempt towards public representatives and may contribute to a climate in which offline violence becomes more likely. This case also highlights another increasingly important feature of modern policing: the role of public communication. In today's digital age, police investigations no longer unfold solely in courtrooms or press conferences. They unfold in real time across social media. The initial police statements identified the suspect as a white British male and stated there was nothing to suggest a political or terrorist motive. Those statements were received very differently online. Some argued they demonstrated transparency and helped counter misinformation, while others felt they were unnecessarily definitive at such an early stage, particularly when the investigation was later transferred to counter-terrorism policing following new evidence. Legal commentators have criticised the early communications for potentially shaping public expectations before investigators had established all the facts. This illustrates what discourse scholars have long argued. Language does not simply describe reality, it helps construct how reality is understood. Foucault argued that discourse shapes what societies come to accept as truth, while later scholars such as Norman Fairclough have shown how institutional language influences public perception. In an age where a single police statement can be shared millions of times within minutes, every word matters. Research on social media rumours likewise shows that people tend to treat early, unverified information as credible, making careful communication especially important during fast-moving investigations. Of course, criticism is not the problem. Criticism is essential. Holding politicians accountable is essential. Peaceful protest is essential. Robust debate is essential. Those things strengthen democracy. Violence destroys it. There is another difficult question we should ask. Have we unintentionally created a political culture where opponents are no longer seen as people with different ideas but as enemies? When politics becomes tribal, compromise becomes betrayal. When compromise disappears, hostility increases. When hostility becomes normal, violence becomes easier for a tiny minority to justify. That is not a criticism of one political party. It is a warning for all of us. Whether you're Labour, Conservative, Liberal Democrat, Green, Reform UK or support no party at all, democracy only functions if political disagreement remains peaceful. One aspect of British democracy has always been admired around the world. Our MPs remain remarkably accessible. Constituency surgeries, community events, school visits, doorstep conversations. Many politicians meet complete strangers every week with little more than trust between them. Following the murders of Joe Cox and Sir David Amess, security measures were strengthened. Now, following Anne Widdecombe's death, Parliament is again reviewing how politicians can be protected while preserving that vital connection between elected representatives and the communities they serve. That presents a profound dilemma. If politicians withdraw behind security barriers, democracy becomes more distant. If they remain completely open, the risks become greater. There are no easy answers. Perhaps the greatest lesson from this tragedy is that democracy depends not only upon laws and elections, but upon culture. A culture where we reject dehumanization, where we disagree without hatred, where we challenge ideas without attacking people, where losing an argument never becomes a reason for violence. Anne Widdecombe was a conviction politician. Many people passionately disagreed with her views. Many passionately supported them. That is democracy. Though whatever our political differences, every elected representative should be able to serve without fearing for their life. When violence enters politics, it is not only politicians who lose. Democracy itself becomes the victim. And perhaps that is the question we should all reflect upon this week. How do we preserve passionate political debate without allowing passion to become hatred? For if Britain cannot answer that question, we risk losing one of the defining strengths of our democracy, the freedom to disagree without fear. This week, one of the biggest political stories in Britain wasn't simply about immigration. It was about whether the law should be changed in response to one of the country's most notorious criminals. The government has announced plans to amend the Immigration and Asylum Bill to give the Home Secretary the legal power to remove a protection that currently prevents the deportation of Rochdale grooming gang leader Shabir Ahmed. The proposal follows widespread public concern after Ahmed's release from prison and growing calls for his removal from the United Kingdom. Before we go any further, it's worth remembering why this case has generated such strong emotions. Ahmed was convicted in 2012 for multiple child sexual offences connected to the Rochdale grooming gang scandal. His victims suffered unimaginable abuse, and Parliament has repeatedly recognised both the horrific crimes committed against them and the institutional failures that allowed that abuse to continue for years. The failures exposed by the Rochdale case were not isolated. They became part of a much wider national conversation about child sexual exploitation, institutional accountability, and the responsibility of public authorities to protect vulnerable children. The independent inquiry into child sexual abuse, ICSA, concluded that across several decades, many institutions repeatedly failed to protect children and often placed organisational reputation above the welfare of victims. Those findings have had a profound impact on safeguarding policy throughout the United Kingdom and continue to influence debates about accountability today. So why wasn't Ahmed simply deported when he left prison? The answer lies in an obscure section of the Immigration Act 1971. Ahmed arrived in Britain before 1973 as a Commonwealth citizen, so he falls within a small group of people protected from deportation under legislation introduced more than 50 years ago. The government argues that Parliament never intended those protections to apply to individuals convicted of exceptionally serious offences, and ministers now want the law amended accordingly. At first glance, many people might ask a simple question. If the law produces an outcome that most people think is wrong, shouldn't Parliament change the law? That is a perfectly reasonable democratic question. After all, Parliament is sovereign. Laws are not permanent, they are amended every year as society changes in response to new challenges, new evidence and changing public expectations. Supporters of the proposal argue that if someone commits crimes of exceptional seriousness, particularly offences involving the exploitation of children, they should not continue benefiting from legal protections that were designed for law-abiding residents. They believe changing the law would restore public confidence in both immigration policy and the wider justice system. They also argue that Parliament has a duty to respond where legislation produces outcomes that appear inconsistent with the public interest. Yet there is another side to this debate. Some constitutional lawyers and commentators have questioned whether changing legislation in response to one high-profile individual is good lawmaking. Should Parliament legislate for principles, or should it legislate for people? History shows that laws created in moments of public outrage can sometimes have consequences that reach far beyond the original case. That doesn't necessarily mean the government is wrong. It simply reminds us that difficult cases often make difficult law, and that Parliament must carefully consider not only today's circumstances, but the precedent it may create for tomorrow. There is another important point that hasn't received as much attention. Even if Parliament changes the law, deportation is not guaranteed. The Home Secretary has been clear about that. Removing the legal protection would create a power to deport, but successful deportation also depends on practical and diplomatic realities, including whether another country is prepared to accept the individual concerned and whether any further legal challenges arise. In other words, changing the law is only one part of what can often be a much longer legal process. This illustrates something much bigger. Immigration isn't just about legislation. It's also about international law, diplomacy, and cooperation between nation states. For many people, however, this case has become symbolic. It's no longer simply about one offender. It's about whether the public believes the system delivers outcomes that appear fair. Political scientists often argue that trust in institutions depends not only upon whether decisions are lawful, but whether citizens believe those decisions are legitimate. When those two begin to drift apart, confidence can quickly erode. The Rochdale scandal also reminds us why campaigners, journalists, victims and former professionals have continued to raise awareness of child sexual exploitation long after the original convictions. One such figure is former Metropolitan Police Detective John Wedger, who has spent many years speaking publicly about child abuse, safeguarding failures and the importance of listening to victims. Whatever views people may hold about particular campaigners or their conclusions, there is broad agreement that child sexual abuse must never be ignored, minimized, or allowed to remain hidden. Interestingly, recent computational research analysing more than 75 years of parliamentary debates has found that immigration discussions in Westminster have increasingly shifted towards border security, illegal immigration and public protection, while debates focused on long-term integration have become less prominent. In other words, the political conversation itself has changed. Whether that's a reflection of changing public priorities, changing political incentives, or wider international pressures is something viewers will undoubtedly have different opinions about. Ultimately, this debate raises three important questions. First, should Parliament change laws when they clearly produce outcomes that many people find unacceptable? Second, how do we balance public protection with long-standing legal safeguards? And third, can governments respond to public concern without creating legislation that may have unintended consequences in future cases? These are not easy questions, and reasonable people will disagree. What is encouraging, however, is that these questions are being debated in Parliament rather than decided through anger or outrage alone. That is exactly how democracy is intended to function. Governments propose, Parliament debates, the public scrutinises, and ultimately elected representatives decide. Whether you support this proposed change or oppose it, this week's debate reminds us of something fundamental. Immigration policy is never just about borders. It is about justice. It is about public confidence. It is about the rule of law. And perhaps above all, it is about the difficult responsibility every democracy faces. Balancing compassion, security and fairness while maintaining the trust of the people it serves. One of the most important decisions you will ever make isn't where you work, what degree you study, or even how much money you earn. It's who you choose to surround yourself with. We often think success is determined by intelligence, talent, or opportunity. Those things certainly matter. Yet psychology, history, and lived experience all point towards another powerful influence, our environment. The people we spend the most time with shape our beliefs, our habits, our ambitions, and ultimately the direction of our lives. Psychologist Albert Bandura transformed our understanding of human behavior through social learning theory. His research showed that people learn not only through direct experience but by observing others. We imitate attitudes, behaviors, and expectations, often without even realizing it. If we repeatedly see resilience, discipline, and integrity, those qualities become more familiar and achievable. If we are constantly surrounded by cynicism, negativity, and hopelessness, those patterns can become normal too. This isn't simply theory. Researchers Nicholas Christakis and James Fowler have shown that behaviors and emotions can spread through social networks. Happiness, smoking, obesity, and even generosity appear to be influenced by the people around us. Other psychologists, including Elaine Hatfield and colleagues, have demonstrated the phenomenon of emotional contagion. We unconsciously absorb the moods and emotional states of those closest to us. Human beings are remarkably social creatures. We don't simply live alongside one another, we influence one another. That brings me to Robert Greene. In his book Mastery, Robert Greene argues that every great achievement begins with an apprenticeship. Whether he is writing about Leonardo da Vinci, Charles Darwin, or Benjamin Franklin, a common pattern emerges. Before they became masters in their own right, they spent years learning from people who had already travelled the path they hoped to follow. Greene calls this the mentor dynamic. A good mentor does more than teach technical skills. They shorten your learning curve. They challenge your assumptions. They point out blind spots that you cannot yet see yourself. Most importantly, they expand your sense of what is possible. Greene also makes an important point that many people overlook. The purpose of a mentor is not to create dependence. The goal is growth. Eventually, the apprentice must develop an independent voice, think critically, and contribute something original. True mentorship is about helping another person become capable of standing on their own. Yet Greene offers another warning that is just as important. In the laws of human nature, he argues that envy is one of the most powerful and least acknowledged human emotions. Most people will never openly admit they feel envious. Instead, envy often disguises itself. It can appear as sarcasm, constant criticism, discouragement, or repeated attempts to minimize another person's achievements. That does not mean everyone who disagrees with you is jealous. Constructive criticism is essential for learning and growth. We all need people who are willing to challenge us honestly. Greene's point is more subtle than that. Sometimes people become uncomfortable when someone close to them begins to change. If one person becomes healthier, starts a business, pursues education, or breaks free from addiction, it can unintentionally challenge the people around them. Your progress may remind someone else of opportunities they never took or goals they abandoned. In those moments, encouragement is not always the response. Occasionally, resistance is. Understanding that distinction is incredibly important. Ask yourself a simple question. Do the people around you celebrate your success? Or do they constantly remind you why your goals are unrealistic? Do they encourage your growth? Or do they encourage you to stay exactly where you are because change makes them uncomfortable? Psychologist Carol Dweck's work on the growth mindset reminds us that human abilities are not fixed. People develop through effort, learning, and persistence, but growth rarely happens in isolation. Our environment either supports that process or quietly undermines it. Clinical psychologist Jordan Peterson has often argued that one practical way to improve your life is to build friendships with people who genuinely want the best for you. Whether or not someone agrees with all of Peterson's wider views, this particular point reflects a broader principle recognized across psychology. Supportive relationships are strongly associated with resilience, well-being, and personal development. Healthy friendships challenge us, encourage responsibility, and provide support during difficult periods. I have seen this in recovery communities. I have seen it in business. I have seen it in education. Transformation rarely begins with one dramatic moment. More often, it begins with a conversation, a mentor, a sponsor, a teacher, a coach, or a friend who sees potential in us before we see it in ourselves. Perhaps the most important lesson from psychology, history, and lived experience is this: no one reaches their full potential alone. The people around us quietly shape our standards, our confidence, and our ambitions. The right mentor can accelerate years of learning. The right friend can encourage us when we begin to doubt ourselves. Equally, the wrong environment can slowly convince us to lower our expectations and settle for less than we are capable of becoming. This doesn't mean we abandon people who are struggling, nor does it mean we dismiss everyone who challenges us. Honest criticism is essential for growth. Yet there is a profound difference between someone who challenges you because they want you to improve and someone who discourages you because your progress makes them uncomfortable. History's greatest innovators, scientists, entrepreneurs, and reformers rarely succeeded in isolation. They sought out teachers, mentors, and communities that stretched their thinking, raised their standards, and inspired them to pursue excellence. So perhaps the question isn't simply, what are your goals? Perhaps the better question is, who is helping you achieve them? Take a moment this week to reflect on the people you spend the most time with. Do they leave you feeling more hopeful, more disciplined, and more determined to grow? Or do they leave you feeling drained, cynical, and less willing to pursue ambitions? While you cannot always choose your circumstances, you can become increasingly intentional about the environment you build around yourself. Sometimes the greatest act of self-respect is surrounding yourself with people who challenge your excuses, celebrate your progress, and remind you of the person you are still capable of becoming. Human potential doesn't flourish by accident. More often it grows in the company of people who expect more from us than we expect from ourselves. Choose those people wisely, because over time they won't simply influence your future, they will help shape it.